Ahoy there, interwebs, and welcome to a pirate-themed episode of Flagshaming. This is actually part 2 of a Jolly Roger double feature, so if you didn't watch Wednesday's episode of How Fascinating, shame! The main takeaway from it is that there were only like 4 pirate flags in common use, historically. Many of today's most recognizable designs were completely made up or only assigned to specific pirates during the past century, but I still intend to judge them on their own merits. First up, we have the classic Death's Head design of the Jolly Roger, that is, a skull with or without crossbones, as written sources from the era often didn't specify. Flags of this design were flown or allegedly flown by Black Sam Bellamy, Stede Bonnet, Edward England, John Taylor, Richard Worley, and Edward Blackbeard Teach. Henry Morgan allegedly, but not actually, used a red background instead of black, as did a variant flag attributed to Henry Avery. Avery's fictional flags also put the skull in profile, and a red sparrow was added to the black variant to create the equally fictitious flag of Captain Jack in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Christopher Condon supposedly flew a pennant with 3 death's heads, which, despite a lack of evidence naming him specifically, wouldn't have been out of place for the period. The Boston Gazette of 1720 tells us Bartholomew Roberts flew a black flag with death's head and a cutlass, while the flag popularly but wrongly attributed to Stede Bonnet shows a skull above a single longbone, flanked by a dagger and a heart. Captain Napin's flag showed a death's head and an hourglass, as did Emmanuel Wynn's. The additions of a skeleton or an arm holding a dagger produce flags associated with Thomas Coughlin, and you'll note the usage of the phrase associated with rather than used by. To be perfectly honest, I've got nothing against any of these designs. You may even recall that all the way back in episode 0, I used the classic Death's Head Jolly Roger as an example of a flag that is simple enough to be recognizable, even if the layperson can't draw a skull from memory. My favorite Death's Head variant by a nautical mile, however, is the one associated with Calico Jack Rackham. It's a shame that this one seems to have been made up and falsely attributed to him in 1959, because the design is fantastic. It's bold and relatively simple, with no writing, 2 stark colors, and a double dose of symbolism. The skull clearly represents death and mortality, and anecdotally, the crossed swords represent Calico Jack's 2 ladies, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who are also my favorite pirate couple. Yes, I said couple, but whether they were lovers or just gals being pals is up to interpretation. Happy Pride Month, by the way. The swords may not be quite as iconic as a pair of crossbones, but they're recognizably unique. A white skull and crossbones on a plain black field could be the flag of any one of half a dozen pirates, or it could represent generic danger, death, or poison, although that last one is gradually being supplanted by Mr. Yuck. Meanwhile, a skull over crossed swords evokes the Death's Head motif, but also still inarguably communicates piracy. Hell, if you just do a Google image search for a pirate flag, about half of the results will use a pair of crossed swords instead of bones. Now that is what I call an iconic look, and I'd expect nothing less from the man who got nicknamed for his fashion sense. #aesthetic. After Death's Heads, we have entire skeletons. A black flag with a white skeleton was flown by Richard Worley and possibly George Lowther, while a white flag with a black skeleton was used by Olivier Labousse Levasseur. He also used just a skull, again with the unusual black-on-white color scheme. A red skeleton on a black flag was used by Edward Lowe, who also might have used a green flag with a golden figure of a trumpeter on it. This latter flag was not a Jolly Roger, but was rather allegedly used to call on other ships for consultation. Edward Lowe's best-known flag, however, brings us to the next common design. It depicts a skeleton holding an hourglass in its right hand and stabbing a heart with its left. Sometimes the skeleton has horns or a crown, or is a living man, or is holding 3 arrows instead of a spear, or a pair of crossbones while the spear floats to its left, and in one instance the field was actually dark blue, -1, but these are all just variations on a shared theme, and boy howdy was it shared. Flags of this general design were used, or allegedly used, by Edward Lowe, Charles Harris, Francis Briggs, John Phillips, Bartholomew Roberts, William Moody, John Quelch, and most infamously Edward Blackbeard Teach. In a supreme instance of irony, it is Blackbeard that the flag has become most associated with, despite a complete lack of period evidence that he ever used it. Meanwhile, we have period documentation that this general design was used by at least 5 of his aforementioned piratical colleagues. Sometimes fame just ain't fair. But is the flag well designed? In short, hell yeah. The flag was popular enough to get misattributed to the man who is arguably history's most famous pirate, and it wouldn't have been so popular if it weren't good. Furthermore, the horns, which I still believe were meant to be a crown, are a nice little addition to distinguish Blackbeard's flag from the rest of the family, making it both distinct and yet still related. Sticking with the family resemblance, we have this flag which also features a figure brandishing a weapon and an hourglass alongside some disembodied parts, and it's generally attributed to both Walter Kennedy and Jean-Thomas Dulain. The latter is also said in a 1727 letter to have flown a black flag with white markings in the form of heads cut off with a cutlass, the rest bones and sandglasses. The flag on screen now is a more recent creation based on this description, but the original probably didn't look exactly like it, which is good because this design is a mess. Shame! None of the symbols are particularly complicated on their own, the way a state seal would be, but there are so many that they just make the flag look cluttered. If I were to redesign it, I'd take some design cues from one of Bartholomew Roberts' historical flags and the modern flag associated with Stede Bonnet. One skull is enough, make it bigger and move it to the center, but keep the sword underneath, like on Roberts' flag. Keeping the hourglass and crossbones smaller, they can now frame the skull like the dagger and heart on the Bonnet flag. Speaking of Black Bart, let's take a moment, or 12, to examine Bartholomew Roberts and his 500 flags. Okay, so it was closer to 5 than 500, but given that his entire pirate career lasted less than 4 years, half a dozen flags seems like a bit much. We've already taken a look at his death's head and skeleton with a spear flags, but these were just his versions of more common designs. The flag which is perhaps most associated with him, ironically, is also the one that I'm pretty sure he never used. On it we see a pirate and a skeleton, presumably representing Death and Captain Roberts himself. As I mentioned in Part 1, there exists some debate as to whether he and Death are holding an hourglass or a chalice. Proponents of the former, like myself, have said that this is a pictorial representation of the phrase, "Between Roberts and Death, your time is running out." That's pretty cool, but proponents of the latter say Roberts is offering Death a drink, and the phrase represented is, "Roberts welcomes Death." I disagree with this interpretation for 3 main reasons. 1. Roberts discouraged drunkenness to the point that it's a popular misconception that he was a teetotaler. 2. Unlike a bowl of rum punch, the hourglass was a popular symbol of mortality at the time. And 3. Who welcomes death? Certainly not Roberts, because this design is probably based on a misinterpretation of his true flag, which looked like this. According to Charles Johnson's A General History of Pirates, it had the figure of a skeleton in it, and a man portrayed with a flaming sword in his hand, intimating a defiance of death itself. Roberts' next most famous flag was adopted later in his career, and features a figure presumed to be Roberts himself, standing atop a pair of skulls with the captions ABH and AMH. These labels stand for a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, because Barbados and Martinique were 2 islands against which Roberts had sworn vengeance after feeling that they had wronged him. Rule number 4 of flag design is no letters or seals, because according to Ted Kay, if you need to write the name of what you're representing across the bottom, your symbolism has failed. Well, not only has Roberts failed at symbolism, he's also failed at writing the name of the thing on his flag. I didn't even think that was possible, and yet here we are. Nobody is going to look at the initials ABH and think, oh, that obviously stands for a Barbadian's head. When I first saw them, I assumed they were some common Latin abbreviation like QED or RIP. These days, I think they should stand for a billionaire's head and a millionaire's head, but that's just me. Colorado figured out how to use initials to make a good flag design. Bartholomew Roberts didn't. Shame! I made 2 fixes for this flag. The first merely removes the ugly lettering, but the second also removes Roberts to give more attention to the skulls, which are the important part. Roberts himself is represented by his flaming sword, which severed those heads. Next is the fictional flag of the fictional piratess Jacquot de la Haye, also known as Back from the Dead Red, for her bright red hair. That's why I find this flag design slightly confusing. The woman on the left seems to share de la Haye's conviviality with death in a display reminiscent of the Danse Macabre, but she's clearly a brunette. If you can include a red heart, why not red hair? It's just all around baffling, so... shame? For my redesign, I removed the unnecessary droplets of blood from above the heart and put the red back in de la Haye's hair. Incidentally, this isn't the only female pirate flag with red hair. I've also seen this modern version called the Molly Roger. This name is even better if you know that Molly was a period British term for a woman of ill repute, and even better still if you believe the claim that the Roger half of Jolly Roger comes from rouge, the French word for red. Thus, the Molly Roger would be the red-haired woman of ill repute. How apropos. Speaking of red, this next flag is fairly distinct amongst Jolly Rogers for its bright red field. It's frequently attributed to Christopher Moody, even though he was never a captain and therefore wouldn't have had his own flag. The design is relatively simple with no writing on it, and it also uses meaningful symbolism. The winged hourglass is a little visual pun representing the Latin phrase tempus fugit, meaning time flies, when you're having rum. Where it falls down is rule number 3, use 2 or 3 basic colors. Most Jolly Rogers use only 2, white on a solid black field, maybe with some red accents, or just 1, like the original black flag or bloody red banners. This design uses 4, and unfortunately, not terribly well. There's not enough contrast, in my opinion, between the white and yellow symbols and the bright red field, which also makes the dark black wings look jarringly out of place. Shame! My solution was a simple palette swap. I made the wings white, as well as the skull to keep the colors balanced across the width of the flag. Also, I gave it a gold tooth, just because. Finally, for today, we have the flag of Thomas Tew. Not really, but let's just say it was, for the sake of argument. Is it any good? Well, I think it's a good example of how iconic a color scheme can be. This is the only pirate flag, either real or fictional, which we've looked at today that didn't have a skull on it, and yet it doesn't look out of place. Just having a white symbol on a solid black field is enough to make a flag look piratical. The sword doesn't hurt either, unless you get hit with it. In summary, most pirate flags, whether they were real, fictional, or simply misattributed, had pretty good designs, with none of the ones we looked at today getting any grade lower than a B on my personal flag grading rubric, which is more than I can say for US state flags. Jolly Rogers shares such a strong unity of design that if a flag, any flag, has a skull and or a black field, it's going to look at least a little piratical. Of course, not every black flag with a skull on it is a pirate flag. Go ahead, ask me how I know. Anyway, that concludes our Jolly Roger double feature. Thank ye for watching, and have a nice day. Flags weren't the only things pirates shared either. I swear, every third swashbuckling scoundrel on the high seas was named some variant of John, Thomas, or Edward, such as Edward's Lowe, England, and Teach. If it weren't for the fact that none of their careers overlapped, this conversation could have taken place. So I was talking to Edward the other day. Hold up, Edward England or Edward Teach? Edward Lowe. I be Edward Teach. Wait, really? I thought you was Edward Lowe. You know what? Screw it. From now on, I be Blackbeard. Blackbeard shouldn't be confused with Black Bart, nor should he be confused with Black Sam Bellamy, but feel free to confuse Black Bart with Bartholomew Roberts, because those two were actually the same person. You see, due to aliases being very useful in a life of crime, many notable pirates had multiple names, and this can lead to some understandable confusion. Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts was actually born John Roberts, and Mr. J. Plantain seems to have gone by both John and James at various points. John Taylor may have actually been Richard Taylor, and Thomas Coughlin was the same person as Jeremiah Coughlin, but Christopher Moody and William Moody were actually different pirates.